for joining us here on Capitol tonight. I am Rena Diamante in for Karina Kling. The execution of a Texas man is on hold for now after a last-minute maneuver by a bipartisan group of state lawmakers and a series of legal actions. Robert Roberson was set to die by lethal injection Thursday, but earlier this week, lawmakers subpoenaed Roberson to testify about his case next week. And a Travis County judge granted a temporary restraining order to allow it. The Texas Attorney General's office quickly appealed, but the state Supreme Court ruled that Roberson's execution should be postponed until legal issues over the subpoena are solved. Advocates for Roberson say they're cautiously hopeful.
I'm relieved, but I'm also still concerned. So I know that we're not out of the woods yet.
Roberson was convicted of killing his 2-year-old daughter for allegedly shaking her to death in the East Texas town of Palestine. But experts and lawmakers say the shaken baby syndrome science no longer holds up. The U.S. Supreme Court declined to stay the execution, but asked Governor Greg Abbott to grant a 30-day reprieve. Let's bring in our reporter roundtable now. Joining us this week, John Moritz with the Austin American-Statesman and Kayla Guo with the Texas Tribune. Thank you both so much for your time. John, I'll start with you. The state House lawmakers used a subpoena as a last-minute maneuver to buy Roberson some time. Just how unusual was this?
It is extremely unusual. It's so unusual it's never been done before. Typically, the legislature does not involve itself with executions as they are scheduled and carried out. They're just out of the mix by that point in time. But in this case, the lawmakers, they were adamant that they thought that the law, the so-called junk science law, was not being followed properly, and they wanted to step in and do something. And the only way they could do it, they say, was to talk directly with the condemned inmate himself. And the soonest they could talk to him would have been 4 days after he had been put to death.
Kayla, were you surprised to see the Texas Supreme Court step in? How rare was that?
Yeah, that was just an extraordinary intervention. It was unexpected for the lawmakers to go to the Texas Supreme Court to begin with. I think anyone following along yesterday, in their minds, this is a criminal issue, so it goes to Texas's highest criminal court. But the fact that they went there was extraordinary, and the fact that the Texas Supreme Court said something different than the criminal court was also extraordinary. I think Judge Elsa Acala, she was a former criminal appeals judge, said to her knowledge this is the first time ever that the Texas Supreme Court has ruled to block an execution. So it was surprising at the end of a whirlwind of a legal day yesterday.
John, you and I have covered the state legislature before. We don't often see some of these lawmakers come together. So in such a show of bipartisanship, how significant is that these progressives and conservatives were able to come together on this issue?
Yeah, the real question, is this a one-off or perhaps an opening where both parties and both wings of both parties can come together from time to time? The unity from the most conservative Republicans on the committee to the most progressive ones was striking. We don't normally see that. We saw them kind of holding hands together, praying together in Huntsville, agreeing with each other's points, tweeting out the same messages. It was quite extraordinary, especially given the tenor of politics over the last decade or so in Texas and in around the country.
Kayla, Governor Greg Abbott hasn't spoken publicly about this. Why do you think that is, and what do you make of that?
He has a very scant record of speaking out and granting clemency. To be clear, he can't defy the state paroles board recommendation against clemency. He can independently grant a 30-day reprieve, but he so far hasn't said anything publicly. State Representative Brian Harrison said this morning that he had quote unquote productive conversations with Governor Abbott and with Attorney General Ken Paxton, but he was keeping those conversations confidential. There's not a ton that Abbott could have done at this point. He could have granted that 30-day reprieve, but he hasn't, which is in line with his history regarding clemency and pardons and that sort of thing.
John, do you think we'll be able to hear from Abbott eventually? And how much time do you think that this maneuver will actually buy for Roberson? And do you think he'll actually appear at a House hearing.
I believe the House committee members want him in Austin. That would mean he'd have to be traveled from Huntsville, securely of course, to the state capitol. Unclear whether he would come in his prison white garbs or whether they would, dress him appropriately for the setting. So the short answer to that is they want him there. The longer answer is not sure exactly how it's going to happen yet. As to the governor, typically governors don't say a whole lot about executions that are out there. They've got, as she noted, they've got a limited authority in this matter, and they don't want to weigh in. They're not supposed to prejudice the the Board of Pardons and Paroles, and so it's basically a reactive role for Abbott or any governor. So typically they don't tip their hands on it just because A, they don't have to, and B, it might not be appropriate for them to do so.
Kayla, does Roberson have any other legal recourse at this point? It seems his supporters will do anything they can.
Yeah, it's not totally clear at this point what remaining legal recourse Roberson has. The courts, including the U.S. Supreme Court, the Texas's highest criminal court, the trial court, have rejected all of his appeals up until this point. So his team is going to have to get fairly creative in their next test and next request in this time that he has. But depending on how long his execution gets delayed, which is still, it's not clear how long that'll be, things can change outside of his case. For instance, of the 5 criminal appeals judges who voted against granting him a stay, 3 are leaving the court by the end of this year, which means 3 new judges are coming on starting in January. So if his execution is still delayed by then, it's possible we're working with a new set of judges. The legislature will also be in session starting next year, and members of the House at least have indicated some interest in amending the junk science law that John mentioned earlier. That could have repercussions for Roberson's case. So there are a lot of moving variables that Roberson could point to, could use, again, depending on how long his stay lasts.
Kayla and John, I know you'll be following it all. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having us.
Good to see you.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Let Spectrum News be your resource for balanced, in-depth political coverage. And click the subscribe button here. You can also download our app and watch us on TV to learn more about the candidates, where they stand on the issues, and more. We'll see you then.